a rapid montage of grand, ornate 19th-century American library buildings, the stone pillars of the Boston Public Library, the sweeping main hall of the New York Public Library, the rugged Romanesque facade of a Carnegie Library in a small Pennsylvania town. What if all of this, these temples of knowledge, these monuments of civic pride, the very idea of a free library open to everyone, what if it all came from the pockets of just three men? The title card appears. Every public library built in America before 1900 was funded by the same three men. The proposition feels strangely plausible. The Gilded Age was an era of unprecedented wealth and staggering inequality, an era of robber barons and kings of industry, men with fortunes so vast they could bend the world to their will. It makes a certain kind of sense that our public institutions would bear the mark of a few powerful founders. But this story, the one you think you know, is not wrong. It's incomplete. The story you were taught was about top-down charity, of great men bestowing gifts upon a grateful public. The story the records actually tell, when you look at the right documents in the right order, is about something else entirely. It's a story about grassroots democracy, local taxes, and a forgotten revolution that began in a small New England town, decades before the first great philanthropist ever wrote a check. And that quieter, more democratic story is measurably, verifiably real, which might be exactly why the story about the three great men is the one that survived. Before the grand philanthropic gestures, before the million-dollar checks and the buildings with famous names carved over the door, you have to look for a different kind of document. Not a will or a trust, but a law. The official story of the American Public Library often begins with Benjamin Franklin and his Library Company of Philadelphia. But Franklin's brilliant idea was a social library, a subscription library. You paid dues to get access. It was a private club for intellectual self-improvement, not a public utility. The truly radical idea, the one that forms the bedrock of the modern system, came 50 years later. It didn't come from a wealthy industrialist in a New York City boardroom. It came from the citizens of Peterborough, New Hampshire. In 1833, the town of Peterborough did something no one had ever done before. They voted to use public tax money to establish a library that would be owned by the people and free for all to use. This wasn't a gift from a wealthy patron. It was a collective civic decision. It was the first free public library in the world supported by public taxation. This single event is the patient zero of the American public library system. Then, in 1849, the state of New Hampshire took Peterborough's idea and scaled it up. They passed the first law in the United States authorizing towns to levy taxes for the specific purpose of establishing and maintaining public libraries. Massachusetts followed with a similar law in 1851. Hold that detail. The legal and financial architecture for a taxpayer-funded, publicly owned library system was being built by state legislatures in the 1840s and 1850s. This wasn't a dream. It was a functioning, expanding model. The Boston Public Library, chartered in 1848 and opened in 1854, became the archetype. A grand municipal institution founded not by one donor, but through a combination of private gifts and, crucially, a state-level act creating a municipal tax base for its permanent support. So when you hear the story of the great philanthropists giving America its libraries, remember this. They were not inventing a new idea. They were arriving with immense wealth and influence to a party that had already been going for 50 years. They didn't build the foundation. They built on top of it, so spectacularly that their mansions cast a shadow long enough to hide the cornerstone. So if the premise of the title is a myth, where did it come from? It came from men like this one. Enoch Pratt, a Baltimore merchant and financier, born in 1808. In 1882, Pratt did something astonishing. He went to the city of Baltimore and offered them a gift of over $1 million, a figure worth more than $30 million today, to establish a free public library system. The Enoch Pratt Free Library opened in 1886. It was a massive, system-wide founding, seemingly overnight from the pocket of a single man. Here, at last, is a figure who seems to fit the three-men theory. His donation was so large, his vision so complete, that he looks like a founder of the whole system. Pratt's grant even came with a clause that was deeply progressive for 1882, specifying the library shall be for all, rich and poor, without distinction of race or color. Though the actual implementation of this ideal in a segregated Baltimore was, to put it mildly, complex, the founder's intent was on the record. Pratt seems like a strong candidate for one of our three men. Let's go looking for the second. Travel north to New York City. The name most associated with the city's iconic library on 42nd Street is the New York Public Library. But when it was founded in 1895, it wasn't the creation of a single person. Its very formation debunks the one-man theory. The NYPL was a merger, a consolidation of three existing but struggling private foundations. There was the Astor Library, a generic description of a non-public library. There was the Lenox Library, the private collection of a wealthy bibliophile named James Lenox. It was a magnificent treasure trove of rare books, but it was notoriously inaccessible, with restrictive hours and a forbidding atmosphere. Neither of these was a true public library in the modern sense. They were museums for books. The catalyst for change came from a third source, the Tilden Trust. Samuel J. Tilden was a former governor of New York who nearly became president. When he died in 1886, his will set aside the bulk of his fortune, about $2.4 million, to establish and maintain a free library and reading room in the city of New York. After a lengthy legal battle over the will, the Tilden Trust finally emerged with the money. But instead of starting a fourth library, the trustees made a brilliant move. In 1895, they agreed to combine the Tilden endowment with the assets of the Astor and Lenox libraries. One of the grandest public libraries on earth was not a gift from one man. It was a merger of three fortunes, from three different men, just to create one institution. The story is already more complicated than the title suggests. There's George Peabody, a financier from an even earlier generation, who funded the Peabody Institute in Baltimore in 1857 and libraries in his Massachusetts hometown. His philanthropy predates Pratt and Tilden's major gifts. So is he the third man, or was he the first? You begin to see the problem. The three men narrative isn't just wrong because it erases the citizen-led movement. It's wrong because even within the world of philanthropy, it was never a club of three. It was a loose collection of wealthy individuals acting on a mix of motives, all building on a civic model they did not invent. And then, late in the century, the biggest name of all enters the field, and he changes the game completely. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, the author of The Gospel of Wealth, the man whose name is so synonymous with public libraries that it has erased almost every other. Surely, he is the third man, the most important man who funded every library. Andrew Carnegie's major library philanthropy was a 20th century phenomenon. Between 1901 and his death in 1919, he would fund the construction of a staggering 1,689 public libraries in the United States. He was a dominant force, a one-man library building industry. But the question is about libraries built before 1900. When you go to the records, as the library historian George S. Babinski did, you find a very different picture. Before the year 1900, Andrew Carnegie had made commitments to build approximately 14 public libraries in the United States. 14. It's a significant number, but it is not every library. It's not even a sizable fraction. Carnegie's first major library project in the U.S., in his hometown of Braddock, Pennsylvania, only opened in 1889. By the time it was built, the tax-supported public library movement was already over 50 years old. Carnegie was an accelerator, not an originator, but it's how he accelerated the movement that provides the final, most elegant twist in this story. He didn't just give money away. He applied a rigid and brilliant formula. It was called the Carnegie Formula. To get a Carnegie grant, a town had to do two things. First, it had to provide the land for the building. His money was for the structure only. Second, and this is the crucial part, the town's government had to formally commit to funding the library's annual operations with tax revenue equal to 10% of the original construction cost. Forever. Think about what this means. Carnegie wasn't creating Carnegie libraries. He was using his private fortune as a lever to force municipalities to create publicly funded, taxpayer-supported libraries. He was making the New Hampshire model of 1849 a mandatory condition of his own charity. A town that wanted a $50,000 Carnegie library had to pass a resolution to budget $5,000 a year, every year, from public taxes to pay for staff, books, and maintenance. This was his genius. He turned the argument about handouts on its head. He wasn't giving a fish. He was providing a fantastic, top-of-the-line fishing pole, but only to communities who proved they had already built a lake and were willing to pay to stock it for eternity. He used the power of private wealth to lock in the principle of public tax support across the entire country. In doing so, he massively scaled up the very movement that his own legend would come to overshadow. The story ends where the story began, with local taxes, passed by local governments, supported by the public. Carnegie's name went over the door, but the public's name was on the check, year after year. So the claim that three men funded every public library before 1900 is false. The real story is of a citizen-led, tax-based movement that was later supercharged by Gilded Age philanthropy. But that leaves one final question. Why? Why did these men, Pratt, Tilden, Carnegie, Peabody, give away fortunes that were acquired through often brutal means? The answer is complex. You have to understand the philosophy that drove them, a philosophy Carnegie himself articulated in an 1889 essay called The Gospel of Wealth. Carnegie argued that the amassing of great fortunes by a few was not only acceptable but beneficial for society. The role of the wealthy man was to acquire as much as he could in his lifetime, and then, in his later years, to dispense that wealth for the public good in ways he, the enlightened industrialist, deemed best. He was to be a trustee for the poor, distributing his surplus wealth to create the ladders of opportunity, libraries, universities, concert halls, by which the industrious poor could climb. It was a compelling justification for extreme inequality. It was also, historians argue, a powerful tool for social control. By funding libraries, men like Carnegie could shape what the working classes read. They could promote an ideology of self-improvement, suggesting that success or failure was a matter of individual effort and literacy, not a rigged economic system. The libraries were a way to legitimize their fortunes, to launder their reputations, and to transform the raw material of industrial capitalism into a lasting legacy of public benevolence. There is no simple verdict here. The source of the wealth is suspect. The motives are a complex mix of genuine belief, ego, and social engineering. But the buildings are undeniably real. For 100 years they have stood as open doors, offering opportunity and refuge. The great irony is that the story that survived, the myth of the few great men, is the one that best serves the gospel of wealth narrative. It's a story that centers the donor, not the community. It celebrates the benevolent wisdom of the wealthy elite. It quietly erases the 50 years of democratic, civic, taxpayer-funded effort that came first. History is easier when it has a hero, a single name you can attach to a great achievement. The true story of the American Public Library doesn't have three heroes. It has thousands of them in town halls and state legislatures across the country, casting votes, passing laws, and building a foundation so strong that even the weight of Gilded Age fortunes couldn't crush it. They simply built on top of it. And in the process, they almost made us forget who laid the first stone.